Ever wondered about drunkenness in early rabbinic texts? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be discussing on this 163rd episode of The Jewish Drinking Show, bringing L'chaim to life. This is a summer series, 4-part. We're starting with Mishnah, Tosefta, and Midreshei Halakhah, Tanaitic, early rabbinic stuff today for May. For our next month's session, we'll look at all of the references to drunkenness in the Talmud Yerushalmi, and then a 2-parter for the back half of the summer on drunkenness in the Talmud Bavli. No one has done this before. I don't think that just written, forget podcast. Written, nobody has ever done such a study on drunkenness. Our summer series is focused just on the rabbinic stuff. It's the foundational stuff to Judaism. We've got 4 texts that discuss drunkenness. We have here, it is one who immersed himself in a river, and then there was in front of him another river, and he crossed it. The second water purifies the first water. I'm not an expert in these matters, but from what reading I did do on this, the idea, apparently he picks up some, going through that first river, having some water on him. If you were to touch fruits or something, it could acquire tumah. Right. However, the second water, when he walks into the second river, that cleanses him of that water that would make it susceptible to tumah. Now, it says, if his fellow pushed him in while drunk or his beast pushed him in, so there's not an intentionality of going in. And apparently this is I'm not sure if this is the same river or a different river, but either way, the second water purifies the first water. But if you did it out of playfulness, it comes under the law of if water be put, which basically, one thing I learned, I do not know how this works. All I know is that it doesn't do like in the very first instance. It does not purify from the first water. I do want to point out, this is interesting. When we did this last summer, this was my translation. I looked back at Sepharia and they had a different translation. It wasn't drunkenness. It says, if you go to Sepharia, it says if they were exercising. I'm like, right. I'm like, that's not even, why would you do that? Also, who is exercising and pushing your friends into rivers? And what's more likely, you're exercising or you're drunk and you push your friend into a river? So I just thought that was a strange, they went out of their way to differently translate that. What I think is the highlight I do want to point out, is there's a lack of intentionality for that particular case. Either his animal pushed him in or his friend while they were drinking or they were drunk pushed him in, which is, there's a lack of intentionality, obviously on the friend or the animal's part. But the other thing is, that happens apparently. That is a plausible situation. You're by a river, maybe a sea, and you're drinking or you're drunk, and you got buddies with you.
Or you're exercising.
Yeah.
Is the friend drunk?
Yeah. Yes. The friend is drunk.
Drunken friend has pushed him.
Right. But usually it's not like you're just one friend is drunk. Right. So fine. The friend is drunk. This person we don't know is indeterminately. They're like Schrodinger's.
It's not clear.
Right.
The friend is drunk.
Yeah, it's the friend.
Or if
the pushed person is.
The pushed person is drunk.
I mean, you could be susceptible to being pushed in if you're drunk, but likely pushing person is the drunk person.
Right.
Yeah.
That's what makes the most sense. That the person who's pushing is drunk, or the animal is pushing you. Right. One of the two things are pushing you.
So the second one, this is a fun one. So if they poured a cup of wine to someone, he said, "I'm now a Nazir from this." Okay, great. He's a Nazir. Someone's poured someone a glass of wine, and he's offered this glass of wine. He says, "No, I'm a Nazir from this." He's now fully a Nazir for all the things that a Nazir is now supposed to do.
Even if you just wanted to say, I don't want another cup of wine, it's my excuse.
Right. And that includes the haircutting, that includes not being near corpses. That now triggers for him this is the rabbi setting up this sort of blanket situation that you could be at a party, offered a glass of wine as it happens. He said, "I'm now a Nazir. Too bad." Now, there is a story now. We now have a story in the Mishnah of a woman. This is now a woman. She's offered a glass of wine, but she's already drunk. She's at this party. She says, you know what? I'm a Nazaretess from this. Which is kind of strange because she clearly has been drinking. She is already drunk. She is gone. She's like, no, I can't. I'm now Nazaretess, right? I'm Nazirah. So what do they do with this? So the sages said,
I mean, if they were having frat parties, I totally understand why she could have been in this situation. Like a lot of peer pressure to drink more, and then so she's like, they'll respect the halakha. I'll tell them I'm
right. So one of the things that happens throughout Mishnah Nazir, I'll just give you some more context, is even like it's almost like you have these code words or these trigger words, like even a brief statement acknowledging that I want to now trigger or become a Nazir. Boom, you're in. Like that's you don't have to have a full complex declaration. You say I want to be a Nazir. Boom, you're in. Like it's started. So here, that's why for this first guy they're like, oh, you're now a Nazir. Like that's all you needed. But for her, and she was already drunk. I think it'd be one thing if someone was not drunk. Something that we're going to get into in the Tosefta, we're going to see about what type of state of mind you're in when you're drunk and how much can things really take hold. But for here, they're like, this seems kind of strange. I think anybody hearing about the story of this drunk woman saying, I'm a Nazaretess, I'm a Nazirah, well, why now, right? So the sages said, and they clearly did not want to trigger for her an entire 30 days of Nazirut. They say, no, she only meant to say this as far as bringing an offering. So she would bring the offering like a Nazir or Nazirah in her case, but not that it actually triggers a full 30-day period of her being a Nazirah. One of the things that I find really fascinating about this story is that we have, like, women can be drunk. The sages are aware of women being drunk, and it also doesn't trigger actually what she's declaring to be that she's a Nazirah. I do want to point out, drunk lady, so it's not just men who are drunk. She's at a party. The sages were aware that maybe not to actually place upon her full.
But was the man drunk? It didn't say he was drunk.
No, for the first instance, for that general principle thing, it doesn't mean. But for here, it's like, well, you can be drunk. So the third Mishnah here is this Mishnah Truma 1:6. 5 may not give Truma, but if they do, then it counts, which is interesting. It's not saying it's off the table. It's Truma is you give portions to the Kohen, and so you have to take some of your agricultural produce and set it aside. Now, you have to have some sense of what you're doing, right? You have to know, you have to be able to calculate and know what's where, what's what, and what's where, right? So the 5 are a mute person, and the sages aren't typically that keen on mutes in the first place. I guess someone who just doesn't speak. The second one is a drunk person. Third one is one who is naked. Fourth one is a blind person. I guess it would be it's probably doable, but it'd be hard. And similarly to a mute person, they can't speak. And back in their days, they were a highly oral culture, and that's how a lot of transmission was done, not as visual and textually oriented as we are today. The blind person, and then one who has had a seminal emission, and that's probably due to impurity. But again, just as we started off with Mishnah, the Mishnah concludes just to remind us they should not do it. They just should not do it. But if they did, it counts. It's fine. That's okay. Does not say for our purposes why a drunk person, although I could imagine they probably don't have the best sense of calculations or what goes where. I think the takeaway for the drunk person is they can't really figure out what the right amount is. But it's probably close enough. That's why it probably counts anyways after the fact. It's probably close enough. The key takeaway for us from this text is the drunk person does not have the best sense of calculation ability. Should not shock us.
I have a totally different takeaway.
Oh wait, what was your take?
The Mishnah includes all of these places that drunk people are a thing.
Oh, right. Yes, absolutely.
This is normal happenstance.
Right. That's what people. I'm doing truma. What are you doing, honey? I'm taking truma.
People is like a thing.
Yeah.
This is normal.
Yeah, absolutely. We still got one more text. Our fourth and final Mishnah throughout the entirety of the Mishnah that mentions drunk people is this here in Bechorot 7:6. I'm not reading this entire thing, but we're going to skip, 70 to 80% down here, which is concerning the Kushi, the Gichor, the Lavkan, the Kipeach, which are untranslated here, the dwarf, the deaf, mute, the imbecile, one who is drunk, and those with ritually pure marks disqualify a person from performing the temple service and are valid. However, all 9 of these things, however, are valid for an animal to be sacrificed. So the sacrificer, these 9 things are problematic and psulim ba'adam. They're psul. They negate their ability to perform the service.
So you can
it's fine for animals.
sacrifice a drunk goat.
That's right.
No.
So, yes,
Seriously?
that's what it says. So drunkenness here is for humans. So 4 texts we've seen that women are drunk in the Mishnah, and that animals can be drunk, and fun fact, can be sacrificed in the temple.
No way.
Yes.
How did they get drunk?
People feed their dogs beer.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes. My neighbor's done it, but yeah, it happens.
I never did.
I know it's like a party pooper thing to say, but it is a whole list. So I wouldn't necessarily say that like this list.
It's a possible. I don't know. Like, I don't know how
That's
people.
like evidence that animals got drunk, because there are other things on the list.
Animals definitely do get drunk.
Okay.
That is absolutely a thing. I don't know how common it is. Yeah, it is absolutely possible. I don't know if people were intentionally. Also, if you have an animal that wanders over, maybe there's just some wine thing. I don't know, and they lap it up.
Eating them
Yeah,
leftover. What is it when you make beer?
the mash.
Yeah.
The man from bourbon also.
Yeah.
No, but by the way,
Yeah.
all of these are
Yeah.
interesting things because again,
Yeah.
they wouldn't list it unless they were like.
They weren't things,
One
right?
of them is, by the way, people who have 6 fingers on 6 digits on each hand.
Yeah. So it's okay for an
Right?
animal.
So in other words, but my point is that these existed.
So as we think about all 4 of these texts, as all 4 instances of drunkenness in the Mishnah, clearly one thing I think we get out of it is that it happens, right? Whether you're by a river with buddies and someone pushes someone in, because that's probably more likely to happen while intoxicated than sober. And the second instance is this lady being drunk at a party. Drunkenness happens, and it's not only men, it's women. It happens. The third thing we've seen is you shouldn't do it while you shouldn't be separating truma under the influence. But if you did, it's probably close enough. It's probably fine. And this fourth and final one, which is people while probably kohanim in doing the avodah should not be drunk, but drunk animals are allowed to be offered in the temple. Hey there, I hope you're enjoying this episode so far. I wanted to break in and actually let you know this is not the only episode on drunkenness to come out this year. In fact, we have a whole handful of episodes coming out in a little mini series on drunkenness. So you can go check out this along with other episodes all at jewishdrinking.com/drunkenness for episodes, clips, and more. And I hope you're enjoying this episode. I hope you go and check out those other episodes on drunkenness. And now back into this episode on drunkenness. One of the great things about the Tosefta is that in many ways it explains a lot of things that we see in the Mishnah that are much more tersely expressed. So in the Mishnah, look, the things, the texts were created especially, I mean, all of this was oral. All of this, but the Mishnah especially was highly edited and really meant to be dispersed and remembered and traveled around. So what we see here, so we have drunkenness appearing 3 times in the Tosefta, 4 times in the Mishnah, shockingly even fewer in the Tosefta. And the first one explains one of our Mishnah, one of the instances we saw in the Mishnah. What are these different instances of people who should not be doing it? I'm actually I think you can read why the different ones. I'll just read them out. The mute cannot separate truma because he can't bless, right? He can't speak. Why a blind person? Because you need visual ability. We'll get to the drunk one in a moment. And then the ball carry, the person who's experienced a seminal emission because he cannot bless. And then, and that's actually dealt with more in Tractate Brachot. And then what about who's naked? Why not? Because he cannot bless. But they cover with straw or stubble, then you can bless. All right. Now we've got everything we just were talking about previously is now answered. All right. Now what about the drunk person? Which before we even read this and you look at it before we even read it, it has a much longer, there's a lot more words here than all the other ones, right? So that already should point out to the reader, there's a lot, it should be interesting. Okay. Why can a drunk person not separate truma? Midreshei Halakhah does not have, the sense of I don't know, sense of mind, really. Just cannot, you're drunk. Yeah, you're like, I'm not really, it's hard to really calculate what's the thing. Now, he says, even though he is drunk, okay, so now there's this whole thing. Even though someone is drunk, their purchases are still valid purchases, his sales are still valid sales, his gifts are still valid gifts, his vows are still valid vows, his sanctified property is valid sanctified property, and his transgressions are punishable transgressions. And if he is held liable for sin offering, then he must bring a sin offering, and if he is held liable for stoning, he is stoned. There's a lot of things here, and everything counts. There's no, I was drunk, I didn't mean it, I didn't really mean to sell you my bike, my house, my car, whatever. I really meant, because then you have a lot of transactions that just, it would mess with a lot of things. So everything counts, and you can't say, I didn't mean to, hit so-and-so. Like, you did what you did, and you can't just get away with saying, I was under the influence. You are still responsible. The 4 instances of drunkenness we read in the Mishnah, and still the 2 further that we'll see in the Tosefta, it discusses some drunkenness in different situations. But here what we're reading in True Mode is a very clear articulation of where drunkenness stands within the responsibility framework for the rabbis, right? What do we say? Purchases, sales, gifts, vows, sanctified property, transgressions, sin offering. All 7 of these things, or 8 maybe, they're all there. We're not done yet. It says the general rule of the matter. Klal shel davar. Here's the general thing. Shikor harehu kipeach lechol davar. The general rule of the matter is that someone who is intoxicated is like someone who is sober in every respect. Right? There is no clearer articulation by the rabbis, at least in all the texts we're reading tonight, of how the rabbis viewed a drunk person, at least with respect to, responsibility, things that they're held accountable for. They're like anybody else. You can't get away with saying, I was drunk, I didn't mean it, Too bad. What you said, you said. I find that this, of the 3 mentioned, or the 3 texts in the Tosefta that talk about a drunk person, this is really fascinating and the clearest articulation head on talking about a drunk person in text. This Kritot text, this is one who has been drinking wine is invalid to perform the service in the temple. So we're talking about Kohanim, the priest, and is obligated for death. Now this goes back to something we read in Leviticus, and it's chapter 10, verse 9, that Kohanim are not allowed to serve under the influence. They're not supposed to have. The question is actually how much, right? It just says Yaim b'sheichar al tasht, that Kohanim should not drink wine or beer, and that's it. It seems like a very blanket statement. Don't have even a drop. However, this says one who's been drinking wine. It says shasui yain. So the rabbis say, what is someone who has been drinking wine? What is this? What do you mean? It says anyone who has drunk a quarter of log. So now they are quantifying it. If you had a quarter log, it says 1.5 eggs worth. It's a revi. So our times we talk about a few ounces, right? 3, 4, maybe 5, depending upon your measurement, how you think about things. But we're talking about a few ounces of wine. And the wine has to be over 40 days or older. So it's been, we'll just say 6 weeks, right? Basically, if it's 6 weeks aged, fermented really, or older. Now, if this Kohen drank more than a quarter of a log of wine from his wine press, he's exempt, right? You have the enough volume, but it's grape juice.
I was about to ask, is wine in your wine press even alcohol yet?
It's not, because you need to let the yeast work, right? So they're saying if yeast is given 40 days, it'll make the alcohol. Straight from the wine press, that's just sugar water. I mean, there's 0 alcohol.
They say must be older, 40 days or older. So if you're at 30 days, it's still fully alcoholic.
Right. So that's also one of the funny things.
A vat of it, and you'd be within.
Right. So that's the other amusing thing here. Is they're like, well, it's only been fermenting for a couple of weeks or 3 weeks. That's fine. You could have had 5 to 10 ounces of 30-day-old wine, and I guess you don't hit both of those criteria that would trigger you to be obligated for death. That's true. And then, what if he drank less than a quarter log of wine, 4 or 5 years old? He is liable whether he mix it and drink it in little sips. So now if you have a smaller quantity, but now we're talking about it sounds like it's going to be potent, fermented, a really nice stuff, but even a less. So it's there is the volume amount. Now I don't know, maybe you only need it to be 4 or 5 years old, but like if you had let's say 40 days or older, but less than a quarter log, that it could have been aging for 3 years and you had more than a quarter log, or less than a quarter log, and it's been aging for 3 years, you're not chayiv. The Kohen is not chayiv. It's really interesting. Okay. Rabbi Eliezer says, if he drank it in one gulp, he is liable. But if he mixed it, and so when he says mix it, this is diluting with water. If he mixed it and drank it, or drank it in little sips, he is exempt. So now this is a really fascinating introduction. Now, Rabbi Eliezer, I'm going to share with you something, which is that one thing he is very consistent about, and it's also in the Mishnah, he says that you need to be able to say the blessing on wine is borei pri hagaf, and it needs to be diluted. I don't remember what he says, but he's like, you wouldn't say the regular blessing. That's not the way that people drink wine, and they're obviously influenced by Greco-Roman practices that you need to dilute, because that's the way that non-barbarians drink wine. We're civilized people here in Greco-Roman society, and we always dilute it. And Rabbi Eliezer fully bought into that and always believed that you need to dilute wine. That is the proper civil way, and to not dilute it is improper, right? It's just uncivil. So that's one thing he's saying. If you didn't mix, so if he mixed it and drank it, then you're starting to exempt this person, which is interesting. Or drink it in little sips, he is exempt, which is also really interesting. But drinking in one gulp, liable. I'm not going to fully explore this because we're actually going to see more about this in our Midreshei Halakhah stuff. Rabbi Yehuda says those who transgress against the prohibition of drinking wine and serving in the temple are subject to the death penalty. Fermented beverages are, what is this?
Subject to wine?
Yeah, so it's really any, and whether that's beer, whether that's literally anything that intoxicates, right? So wine is not the only alcoholic beverage available to the rabbis. They have beer, they have all sorts of stuff. It's just that it's intoxicating, right? So it's we're not talking about someone who is drunk, right? You don't have to be drunk to transgress this. You just have to be doing some drinking. But it's the drunkenness piece here is the al hamashachrin, the intoxicating beverages aspect. Hey there, I hope you're enjoying this episode so far. I wanted to break in, and if you like learning, exploring early rabbinic texts from Israel about drunkenness, well, here's a sneak peek into next week's episode on drunkenness in the Talmud Yerushalmi.
They decreed and it returned it to the original status.
All right, thank you.
Not the 13.
So the 10 weren't getting them drunk. They said, let's do 3 more for the ditch. And let's do 3 more. But somehow going from 10 to 13 was enough to get people regularly drunk at mourners' houses. I hope you enjoyed that sneak peek into next week's episode on drunkenness in Talmud Yerushalmi. Now back into this episode on drunkenness in early rabbinic texts. So we have our final Tosefta reference. I'm not going to read this whole story. This is a full-on story, way bigger than the story we read in the Mishnah about the drunk lady. This is a full-on story. You are more than welcome to read this. One of the fascinating things about this, this whole story with Rabban Gamliel, who was a very moneyed fellow, leader, very moneyed. But this is really fascinating. So when we get to the end, it says this final paragraph, we learned many things on that day. We learned that a quarter log of wine intoxicates, that walking dissipates the effect of wine, one who is drunk wine should not. Quarter log of wine intoxicates is really what I want to highlight here, which is really fascinating because this is something that the rabbis are saying about this story, that it's not even clear that is what was taking place, but that is something that the rabbis are taking from this. Although it's not entirely clear that this means he was drunk off of a few ounces of wine, but probably that maybe you get a buzz, maybe you're not super duper clear thinking anymore, but maybe you're on the path to drunkenness. When we think about these three texts in the Tosefta when it comes to drunkenness, we see the thing in Kritot that the thing about drunkenness is about intoxicating beverages, not necessarily a drunk person. The final text here from Pesachim, not really clear. It seems to be an inference off of a story that a few ounces of wine intoxicates, but the huge, perhaps one of the most significant things about anything that we're going to read this evening is from this Trumot one, that no matter what, a drunk person is still considered like a normal, sober person in terms of their responsibilities to everything and anything. So, and also, we also got out of the Mishnah and Truma of why a drunk person should not do it, which is like the calculation of the Truma is not going to be so exact. Hey there, I wanted to break in yet again. Although I asked for support in financial ways because it does cost some money to make the hosting happen and other aspects of Jewish drinking happen. So your financial support is definitely appreciated. And don't forget, you can go to jewishdrinking.com/donate. But also, another way of supporting the show and everything that Jewish Drinking does is also to tell your friends, tell your neighbors. If you like this content, if you like this show, maybe people also like it. So feel free to let them know, hey, I have this interesting episode I heard, or a few episodes, or whatever it is, or even a few clips. Feel free to share with your friends. All right, thank you so much. Now back into the show. We've seen all of the references to drunkenness in the Mishnah, all the references to drunkenness in the Tosefta, and now I am very excited to share with you drunkenness in Midreshei Halakhah. We get some stuff here in the Sifra, and this first one I want to share this one first from Sifrei Devarim. So again, these are Midreshei Halakhah are not like other Midrashim like Breshit Rabbah or Vaikra Rabbah or other Midrashim. These are more halachically oriented, or a little bit more closely textual. They're all Tanaitic, early rabbinic. So this first one, I do have to say, so drunkenness in the Torah, there's a few stories of drunkenness in the book of Genesis, and the only other reference to drunkenness in the entirety of the 5 books of Moses is this line in Deuteronomy, which seems to be poetic, the Ashkir Chatze Midam. So what does this mean? That I am going to make my arrows drunk with blood? How can arrows be drunk? Like maybe be wobbly when you shoot it. Like, what does this mean? So the rabbis say, how is it possible to make arrows drunk? And they say, I will make others drunk with what my arrows do. Not what I was expecting.
That's not what I was expecting.
That's a curveball as far as I'm I'm not even sure what that means. Like, maybe by the arrows hitting this person, they themselves will wobble and be like a drunk person, and that they will not be able to walk straight. Maybe that's what the rabbis mean by this, because I think most people, when they encounter this verse, they say, oh, what does this mean that I will make? Yeah, enjoy. That I will make my, I would say that they are just like a drunk person has had a lot of alcohol that they have consumed. So too, these arrows will consume a lot of blood, as opposed to, I don't know, just hitting dirt, missing their target, and just hitting the ground. No, that God will, I will make my arrows drunk with blood, that they will hit their intended targets.
Well, not only that, it almost means they'll destroy their intended targets.
Yeah. Yes.
Totally saturate.
Right.
I mean, that's the meaning
I think
out of that.
Right. So the rabbis definitely went in a
very different
unexpected and different direction, for sure. After having said that I do not understand what's going on with this text, I have actually a good understanding of this text. What the rabbis are perceiving in this verse from Deuteronomy is, it doesn't make any sense. How can arrows get drunk? What does that mean? It sounds poetic. What the rabbis are actually pointing at is saying that it makes others get drunk. Who are these others that are being forced to get drunk? I realize it's probably those allies of enemies who have seen their friends fall in battle being stuck by these arrows. So they see their friends, whether they themselves are being injured, or maybe it's just seeing a fallen ally on the battlefield, and then they go and they drown their sorrows. I think that that's actually what the rabbis here are seeing, that it's almost like a coping mechanism, that these foes, really the allies of the foes, the fallen foes, are going off and getting drunk, having seen how efficacious and effective these arrows are. So this next one, the Sifra Shmini, this is a very close connection with that Tosefta we read in Kritot. This is based off of, they say, Yayin v'Sheichar al Tasht in Leviticus 10:9, that Kohanim, when they go to serve, shouldn't drink neither beer nor wine. Although, here's the fun thing. The rabbis, even though they know that Sheichar means beer, they know. But whenever they try to describe, they try to extract out from the Torah text anything about Sheichar, they always really, they do not translate it as beer, ever, which is just kind of a funny thing. So Rabbi Yehuda says, what is this wine don't drink? This tells me only of wine. Whence do I derive that it should also include all intoxicants that Kohanim should not serve under the influence? He says from beer. Now this is really Sheichar. So then why mention wine? Because wine makes one liable to death. All other intoxicants, that they are kol sha'ari hamashachrim ba'azhara. It's just, there's a warning. So basically, having wine to go and serve as a kohen, that triggers, that's the bad thing. Do not drink wine and go serve. But beer, or really any other intoxicating beverage, you shouldn't do. You get a warning, but it's not the same level of transgression for Kohanim. Okay, so that's Rabbi Yehuda. Now Rabbi Eliezer, he says, wine you shall not drink, and beer you shall not drink. Now again, they don't translate Sheichar as beer for our purposes, even though in their daily lives they talk about Sheichar as beer. They mean something that is intoxicant, because hamashachri means that it intoxicates. He says, you shall not drink it by way of intoxication. But if you pause in drinking or diluted it, he is not liable. So Rabbi Eliezer, as I mentioned before, he is consistent, whether it's in Mishnah, Tosefta here. If you dilute wine, it's not as potent, it's not as powerful. It's also the more civilized way of drinking wine. And so for him, if you dilute the wine, it's an out. It reduces the severity of the transgression of Tzedek on him. But also if he paused in the drinking, right? We saw in the Tosefta, if you did one gulp of the wine, that's a problem. But in little sips, that reduces the severity. And so here too, and clearly that these ways of drinking it are the path to getting drunk, right? If you're just gulping it down or you're having it undiluted, that's how you get drunk pretty quickly. And that's what's going on here. And also, this is an explanation for what we read in the Tosefta, right? So that's one of the cool things about the Midreshei Halakhah, is that they sort of show you the rabbis' ways of thinking that get into the Mishnah, that get into the Tosefta. Our final text, which you might say, I don't know how to count, it's really a series. And if I were to redo this, I would include, so you see it's sort of like section 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. Really, this whole 1 through 7 is dealing with the same thing. And if anybody would like to keep score at home, this is based off of Leviticus 21, verse 20. And it has to do with not able to bring an offering if it has a defect. Okay? So not being allowed to offer something that has a defect. I think it's a person is not supposed to do this. Now we have these different things, which is, whence does it derive for these things for someone not to do this? One who's pole-like in appearance, one who's dwarf-like, a deaf mute, imbecile, one who's drunk, and those with clean plague spots. These are, I'm pretty sure, are Kohanim. But once again, these are Kohanim that are not supposed to be, these are blemishes for Kohanim. But one of these is drunk. This is a drunk Kohen. I'm not going to go into all this. There's a lot here, all these different things, and they keep bringing it up over and over and over again. But really, 1 through 7 would be all these things. And similarly to what we've seen in Trumot and in the Bechorot pieces in the Mishnah, these are included as being blemishes. That being drunk is not a full, but of course it's also a temporary blemish, right? It's something that will go away. And for a Kohen, which is really fascinating, Because in the first place, they're not even supposed to be serving under the influence. They're not even supposed to have anything, but now they're drunk, right? So they went way beyond. Who knows? Maybe they could have had, actually, based on what we saw in the Tosefta, who knows? Maybe they had 20 or 30-day-old wine, and they had a lot of it. So technically, according to the rabbi's rules, they wouldn't be totally transgressing. So they have some wiggle room, but here they're drunk, right? So even if they, get some wiggle room in that direction, that it wasn't old enough, but it still is intoxicating, here they're drunk, and they should not be offering. They should not be bringing karbanos. Should not be bringing offerings. They should not be serving in the temple while drunk. So this is. I'm not going to go into all the mechanics of this and everything. We have this clear thing about. There's not a lot in the Torah who shouldn't drink. Yes, Leviticus 10:9, Kohanim should not serve under the influence. Very reasonable, very understandable. The Nazir also is someone who should not drink, but they're bringing it upon themselves. They're bringing it upon themselves, right? And it's of a temporary nature. And we've seen those things pop up in the Tanaitic stuff here. We've seen both the Nazir piece, although that was a little bit more limited, and here, what exactly are the rabbis couldn't just okay, Leviticus says, don't drink. And the rabbi's like, how much are we talking here? Right? It almost sounds like a negotiation. Like, what do you mean? And when we say, like, what do you mean by wine? Right? Well, it has to be intoxicating wine. Like, well, how intoxicating is intoxicating? 40 days. 33 days is fine. But and it has to, if you have a couple, now it's okay. You have a few sips before you go to work. It's one thing, but 4 ounces is too much. Like, it's just funny. The rabbis are really trying to quantify in that direction. And we've seen that across both the Midreshei Halakhah and the Tosefta. But
it's not an entire prohibition against drinking.
Right. So in the book of Leviticus, you think it is. Right. In the book of Leviticus, you think it is. And then come the rabbis, they're like, well, let's qualify it, or quantify it rather. We looked at drunkenness in all of the Mishnah, all of the Tosefta, all of Midreshei Halakhah. I'm going to work our way backwards. The Midreshei Halakhah, there's not really a lot there, right? Of course, there's this thing about getting drunk, or we saw the thing about Deuteronomy. There was a poetic explanation. We saw that a drunk Kohen, that's not okay. We saw also trying to understand the Kohanim serving. You shouldn't be, for Rebbe Eliezer, you should not be drinking wine in a matter to get you drunk. And to Tosefta, we saw the thing that we learned from Rabban Gamliel's story, also this thing about intoxicating from kritot, but very, very significantly in the Trumot Tosefta, about the purchases, the vows, all these things that are significant, that a drunk person is considered just like anybody else. It's not a valid excuse. And then the 4 instances we saw about drunkenness in the Mishnah, just to close us up, that drunkenness happens. It's a part of life. Maybe your friends are pushing you into bodies of water. Maybe ladies are at parties getting drunk. You shouldn't be doing truma, but it can count. And then finally, we saw also with, a Kohen should not be drunk, but animals can be drunk to be offered, which is really quite fascinating. So this is drunkenness for the early rabbis. We don't, and even in that Tosefta in Trumot that we saw, that they could have demonized, they could have villainized, and yet they didn't. Drunkenness happens for the early rabbis. All right. So with that, l'chaim.